All right, everybody, welcome back to the Business Roundtable Podcast. We're here for another great week, another great new guest. I am your host, David Carr of Steward Your Business, where we're bringing teams together to accomplish great things. And I'm so glad to have Morvareed of Salehpour Legal here on with us today. We've been actually having a number of lawyers on here on the podcast because there's a lot of legal issues out there, but I'm really excited to have Morvareed on here and talk, as we were meeting earlier, about tech, law, AI, cybersecurity. There's a whole lot of things evolving. And so we want to help you make sure you're not missing the mark here on this. And so, Morvareed, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and speaking to our audience. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me, David. I'm glad to join you guys.
Absolutely. So, I love your journey of you've come from working for other firms, and I want you to share that background. And now you've had your firm and you're working with what I loved about startups, smaller firms. They're all different types, but I felt like your take and why I wanted to have you on here today was unique because I'm literally messaging some people today on new AI technologies, new this, that, and the other thing. I was like, how do we do this safely and incorporate it into our business? And you've been speaking on this quite extensively. And so I just want to say thanks again for coming on board and just, take us back a little bit about what got you into Salehpour Legal and your journey.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to share. Yeah, I started off at a large international law firm, over 1,000 attorneys, working with Fortune 100 companies. So I did that for almost a decade, and I realized at that point that it wasn't a good environment for small and mid-sized businesses to get assistance and counsel, and there was a real gap in terms of being able to get quality legal assistance for smaller mid-sized businesses. So I left 8 years ago and launched my own law practice to really focus on working with small and mid-sized businesses who need a more high-touch personal relationship with their attorneys.
Yes.
So be a partner with them, right, and help them business over time.
Yeah. And so, you have, now you've had your company for, I think, 8 or 9 years. Is that right?
8 years, yes.
Yeah. 8 years. That's great. And I love the high touch because I think a lot of people are intimidated, honestly, as I'm talking to other folks, business owners and leaders, Morvareed, they're intimidated. Like, I don't know if I should be talking to them, and I'm going to feel bad about myself if I ask a question, or like, so there's a hesitancy, and that can really cost them if they don't actually lean on you as a trusted advisor.
Yes, very much so. And that's why I love having that personal, close relationship with my clients. They really see me as a resource and someone they trust and are able to reach out to and call when needed, right? Because I want people to help. And one of the important things is you need to call your attorney. So you have to have that relationship that you feel comfortable calling your attorney.
Right. No, it's so important, and to be educated. And I think one of the things you're doing and getting you on this podcast is another way to get the word out. What I love about the Business Roundtable podcast here is we get people the opportunity to experience you, see you in a different light. You're getting a different audience through me and through this venue, and I'm so excited because it gives people the opportunity to learn, ask some questions, and we're going to get into it today on some things that I don't think a lot of people are really clear on, and they might not even know how to ask the question, articulate it, because I feel like there's so much changing in technology and like what is keeping people up at night. So I'd love to explore with you some of the things that you're seeing, and maybe probably the law, I'm sure, is behind on this, but where, like, for example, I mean, AI is the big word, right? Everybody's talking AI this, AI that, but what are the real concerns that we as business owners should be considering as things are evolving?
Yeah. And before we get into it, I want to make one
Yeah,
point.
please.
Something else you mentioned. So you talked about, how a lot of business owners don't know what they should be keeping their eyes out for. And that is so
Absolutely
true. And one of the things I always tell them, what I do with my clients, like a lot of times they may have a preconceived notion about what it is they're doing. Like, I'll give an example. I had a client who thought they were doing a joint venture. So they came and said, I want a joint venture agreement with this party. A lot of people, attorneys, wouldn't have asked questions, but I said, let's get on a call. I want to really understand your goals. Once I got on the call and asked the hard questions, it wasn't a joint venture. It was a beta test, which has very different implications for intellectual property, ownership, and rights. And so a lot of times that's the important thing is you don't necessarily need to know what the answer is or what you think the answer is, but if you call in your attorney, the attorney will help you figure it out, right?
That's a great observation. I've seen that in my space of environmental consulting for 25 years, where somebody's saying, I need this. And then, like you said, well, maybe, but if you're a savvy consultant, like, or, legal in this case, you're going to be able to ask some tough questions and peel that away and find out, is that really the real issue? And I think there's so many different areas in the legal field. We have so many different specialties, right? So, like, what is it that you need help with? And I know your background particularly is those that are these, startups and looking at some of these things and evaluating them. And if I just had a great conversation the other day on the podcast with a gentleman that does funding for, and like, we're talking about like not asking the right questions and getting things in place. So if you do that in a silo, it's just going to take you longer, and ultimately it will really cost you more than if you just slow down and get the help, like you're saying, Morvareed, and then getting some key counsel here.
Exactly. Like just figuring out what actually fits your goals, right? So that's where I always say it's better to get those discussions started early, right?
Absolutely. And we're only on today's podcast, because we're going to have you come back, because we're only picking a slice, because I wanted to pick this particular topic because, well, it's one that I see a big issue on, and I think it's honestly not that many people are talking about, but you cover the gamut. And by the way, everybody that's listening, we're going to have Morvareed's link to her website, connect with her on LinkedIn. We'll have all that stuff at the end of the podcast, so don't worry, we'll make sure you get plugged in, because she covers a wide range of services. But today, I just really, as we're going to get into a little bit more, is technology. It doesn't necessarily have to be AI, but I figured that's one that probably a lot of people are thinking about, hearing about, and they're like, I don't even know what to do with this. All right. So figuring, like, what should they be considering, for example, even incorporating AI? Some people are like, I don't want to touch it. Other people are like, I know I should, but I don't know where, how to do it. What's the safe way to do it? And so, at a high level, I know there's a whole lot of things to consider here, but what is maybe some of the top legal risks or things you're seeing that when you're starting to integrate AI into your workflow or customer offerings that they should be considering or reading? They need your input, help to protect them, especially intellectual property or otherwise.
Yeah, there's a lot of obviously using AI and incorporating AI is something that is data heavy, right? And there are a lot of considerations that go into its use in an application in a business, particularly around considerations such as confidentiality issues, both for example, sensitive data that you may be handling on behalf of customers, for example, or personnel even, but also just proprietary trade secrets and intellectual property of your own business that you want to maintain secret and maintain that protection for, right? So there's issues around confidentiality and proprietary information. There's issues around data privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property rights. And businesses have to think about this as not only does it come in when you are putting data into the platform, right? So you have to think about, is this information that really I should be keeping confidential? Because inputting is now a breach of confidentiality, especially since a lot of these platforms by default use input to train, right? So they're being for personal purposes. And often it can also show up in potentially an output that is given to other people because they're using it for training, right? So you have to be careful about putting in sensitive information like the categories I described, as there are confidentiality obligations that you may be bound by under law, by contract, same by data privacy obligations. And even with the intellectual property, the output, a lot of these platforms say you own whatever rights they may have to the output, but that doesn't, they don't actually own the rights to the output. And you publish something and there's all these lawsuits. I'm sure many people have heard about how people whose data has been used for training are suing several of these companies and platforms for intellectual property infringement. If the courts end up holding that is infringement and the output can be potentially infringing, then you as a user who published that may be subject to a claim. So it's, you have to be careful about what platforms you're using, how you're using the output. One
Mhm.
thing that's very, I think, important that I've helped clients do who are starting to deploy the technology is put together AI policies for their businesses and
Mhm.
training their employees.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is an ongoing issue because, like you said, AI is changing and evolving. So what you could do with one platform may be okay, but maybe not another one. And so you have to be clarifying, like you said, what, what, where can you use this? How can you use this? It's challenging. It's dynamic, you know. Um, and having somebody like yourself, Marie, that's looking at this and saying, like, let's try to shore this up as much as possible to minimize risk, minimize exposure, and I think doing this more, doing this on the front end is much better than the back end when you're like, oh man. And so, if you haven't looked at this, so as you're listening to Marie talk about this and you're starting to incorporate this, I would say look at it because I would imagine too, and clarify for me, Marie. I mean, depending on when we have, and we're gonna get into a little bit more into data privacy, but we have laws at a federal, state, or local level, depending on what it is. So it gets really complicated, right? On where you're at, how you're accessing data, who's accessing it, is it in the country, out of the country, you
Right,
know.
right. There are obligations, depending on what kind of data you're having an issue. For example, if you are handling health data, there's obviously HIPAA issues involved, right?
Hmm. Yep.
And then you have all the different state frameworks for the privacy for the laws, and a lot of these platforms aren't really set up to handle sensitive data, and you will automatically be breaching your obligations to your customers, given if you're inputting, for example, health data into one of these
Hmm.
platforms, right? So it's so
Yeah.
important. And that's why I say, like, as a business, you need to create like like the AI policy has to be
Something, because
created.
at least you have something, right, to say, "I can hang my hat on at the end of the day. I've done some kind of proactive approach," right, to address this.
Well, it's two things. I think it's one, both being like taking a proactive approach, but I also think it's necessary because without having a formal AI policy that you're having your personnel agree to,
Mhm.
it's like a free for all. So
Yeah.
there's only been breaches. Like Samsung had a couple breaches last year because their employees were putting confidential proprietary information into Samsung. So you don't
Mhm.
want your employees going out and committing these breaches that you may not
Yeah.
even know of because you failed to put a policy in place and train them.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so important, and if you don't have something, yeah, so it's the absence, there's basically, yeah, you're not, you're leaving yourself exposed. So rather than being exposed, say, and then obviously adapt as you need to, look at the policy and see what needs to be updated, you know.
Yes.
Um, I don't know how often you're looking at these things, there is it evolving, but uh, just have a checkup, right? Some kind of audit, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's always good. I think with any kind of policy or contract or everything, I think it's just good to have. I always tell clients, like, end of year, beginning of year is a good time to just have a check-in. Just,
Mhm, mhm.
check in with your attorney, say, what updates have happened to the operations of the business, how you're
Right.
dealing with different parties. And then you can kind of make a determination, like your attorney will help you determine, like, okay, it's time for an update, or you're still kind of good with what we have in place.
Right. So you mentioned data heavy. I think it'd be good too to talk about. And I think data privacy is nothing. It's not new. However, there are still differences in state laws and international. And you'll have to help me because correct me on all the acronyms because I get lost in them myself. Alphabet soup here.
Yes.
But um, where do you see small companies kind of maybe getting caught off guard here with privacy policies or vendor agreements or marketing data? What are the things that they should be looking at?
Yeah. So, particularly in the US, because we do not have a federal level law for just general consumer privacy. And I
Mhm.
think that fortunately it's unlikely that we'll have any in the near future, given that our federal government is just not very effective at passing laws at this point. We are just getting a patchwork of state laws. And so
Mm,
maybe about every 6 months, we have a couple new privacy laws that go in at the state level. So it's
mhm,
actually becoming more complex as a small
mm.
size business to comply.
Yeah.
So for a lot of clients, I've I help them do that analysis of where does it make sense to comply, like, do the analysis of where are our operations, where are we
Yeah.
targeting, how much of our business is in different locations, to try to figure out, when you do a cost benefit analysis, which places should you really make an effort to comply with, and where is it maybe lower of a risk, so you may be able to like live with the risk on. So that's
Yep.
I think that's a situation that a lot of small businesses are having to face, because they don't have the kind of budget and capabilities that larger businesses have to just be able to do like a worldwide compliance, right? There's so many
Hmm.
laws. So I think a lot of it is that kind of targeted analysis of what really applies to your business and how do we comply with that. And then the other thing that a lot of small businesses have been getting in trouble with recently is that a lot of businesses, or maybe they don't even know themselves, because they have vendors, like marketing or advertising vendors they're using, who institute tracking technologies on their
Hmm.
websites. And there's been a lot of lawsuits around invasion of privacy,
Yep.
wiretapping claims under state laws that have been going
Wow.
around. Yeah. So there's a whole host of additional actions and consents and notices that you have to undertake to avoid those issues. So that's been a issue that I've been dealing with from many clients over the past.
No, I see that. I mean, now, but pretty much every website says, "Well, you accept the cookies or whatever of tracking, right, coming
Mhm.
on there." You don't have that, or you don't have some kind of, like, stated privacy policy or something, right, on your website or something like that that speaks to this. Um, can you also speak to, I know, this has been a challenge for businesses, at least in my experience, small businesses, when if they have employees collecting, media, imagery, other things like a consent, right? Or some kind of like what using their likeness or other things like that too?
Oh yeah, yeah. If there are, certain times businesses will, have events or things where they want to use those kind of photography or videos that come out of it. And yeah, it's important to make sure you have an appropriate release in place. That
Mhm.
it's like creating formality, right? Like everything you're doing, you want to make sure you have rights to it, so that when you use it, you don't have people coming out of the woodwork saying, "Well, I'm
Oh,
gonna
yeah.
come after you because I didn't agree to that," right?
Right. I mean, I've done enough, this way before AI, but imagery was a big one where we would be putting together things and like, where are you getting the image? Is this public use, or did
Right.
you get some kind of verification that you could use this? And
Mhm.
sometimes, again, like I said, employees don't know any difference. Like, oh, what's the difference? I'm just going to use this
Well,
picture.
exactly, and that's why, again, it's things like that, it's important to train your personnel, right? And
Hmm.
kinda
Yep.
make sure they understand what is allowed to be used. But also it's important, I've seen clients get in trouble because they've used vendors, and the vendors, maybe use
Hmm.
something that wasn't a public
Hmm.
image, or there wasn't a license to it. So you also have to, when you are using third party like website vendors or blog
Yep.
vendors, again, you need to have very strong agreements in place with them, so that if something
Yes.
does go wrong, you're not going to be on the hook. They're going to be on the hook, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's huge. Right before this, Marguerite, I was talking to an insurance broker, and we were talking about, you know, one company that they signed a clause that said they were to be held, the company they were working with, are gonna be held harmless. Like, if anything happens to their employees, they're held harmless, and they were willing to take that, and then something really bad happened, and they're on the hook. And
Mhm.
so understanding, yeah, your relationships, with contractors, and this kind of leads into my next conversation, about contracts, liability, vendor risk. Particularly, I mean, we cover a lot of areas, but cybersecurity is another big one that keeps coming up. Like, what happens here? How is that, flowing down, and looking at those clauses in master services agreements and other types of agreements. So what are you seeing? Like, how can businesses better protect themselves contractually, particularly as this vendor, or data breach occurs, for example?
Yeah, I think these agreements are, it's a cybersecurity, data privacy are becoming more and more heavily negotiated I feel like every day. These are issues that
Mm,
are potential really large liability exposures for both parties. So it's important to actually take a position on it that has some thought has gone into it, right? And I think the
Mm-hmm.
biggest mistake I see a lot of smaller businesses make is they decide to not bring in legal counsel to help. They decide to
Mm-hmm.
just sign their agreement as is, not make the effort to negotiate or understand what the terms actually mean. Uh, a lot of times, sometimes they'll see a deal as this is what I think is confusing for some business owners. They see a deal as low value, but they don't understand that low value doesn't mean low risk.
Mm.
Value, but high risk. So
Yes.
that can
Yes.
really hurt your business, right? So
Absolutely. If you're not clear on this, 100%, 100%, Marie. I mean, I remember a scenario where, understanding the relationship with your vendors. And
Mhm.
one that came up for me in California was, if you're, because I was working professional services, where you're an independent licensed contractor, I can't sub to you if I'm not an independent licensed contractor. There's flow downs and there's requirements there, and understanding what the risks are if something doesn't work right and who's on the hook here. And I agree with you that idea of, well, it's not like a lot of money or anything. However, if something goes wrong, this is going to cost, you're going to lose everything on this job and then some.
Right, right. Well, a lot of things, particularly when you get into like cybersecurity and data privacy issues, that can make your business bankrupt. So you may be
Mhm.
bankrupting your business because you saw a deal as low value. So that's why it's just something for businesses to kind of think about a little bit more consciously and realize these are things that can affect them on a larger scale. And even if they're like, for example, uh, looking to get acquired down the line, a lot of these agreements, they're
Mhm.
not, they are from often they're for multiple years. So it's all
Mhm.
going to come out in due diligence. And when it comes out, it's going to negatively impact the valuation of the business.
Evaluation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the buyer's not gonna be happy if you agreed to, non-standard terms around these things, and it's gonna
Mhm.
be basically a ding, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Right, they're
something
gonna
that
wanna, like, that's too much, that's risk, or I don't wanna, I'm not gonna be willing to pay that much with that much risk on the line.
yeah, and sometimes they walk away, so you might even
Mm.
lose the deal. So that's why it's important to, again, like, if you are looking to grow your business long term, you're looking to scale,
Mhm.
exit, you need to be thinking about these things on a larger scale.
Yeah, you know, it's like you said, looking at, the contracts you're having with your vendors and the ones that you're accepting on behalf, that are coming through,
Mhm,
and what I think I've learned, Marguerite, is, yes, you have to, evaluate and help, use legal help to evaluate the risks that you're being exposed to, and what you're willing to, you know take, and where, like you said, what's negotiable here on some of these things.
mhm.
um and have somebody that come and educate you, because sometimes I'm like, I don't know, what can I push back on this, or how can I push back on this, or you know um in having your expertise of saying, okay, well, this is, we have standing here, or we have an understanding, or how can we, come together. I find, m- for better or for worse, I found, if you're receiving somebody's contract, it's always going to be in the favor of them issuing the contract, not in your favor typically. They're not like, it's looking after them first. So there's like having somebody like Morvareed on your team say, well, let me look at this and say, how can we make this, mutually beneficial, or have at least an understanding of like how this is all going to go.
Yeah, yeah, and I will say there's many, many situations where I've been working with clients, and they've the other side has drafted the initial version of the agreement, and they send it to me, and I'm like, this is not even close to what you told me you've agreed to with the other side. Like this is
Mhm.
a just different. This is doing something totally different. Like it's so
Yep.
one sided, and so
So one-sided.
strategy is to like negotiate that and approach that at all, like help the client go through as a way to kind of get it to what actually the business people have agreed, right? Um,
Mhm.
sometimes, the other sides, particularly if it's uh, business that's larger or whatever, their attorneys may be like overly aggressive, right?
Mhm. Yeah. I've
They,
seen that. I've seen that, and then, like I said, I was like, "Whoa, this is really one-sided," and this is where you can, like you said, maybe you're so hungry for the deal, you want the deal, but don't do it at the expense of like what you're accepting. potentially, right? The
Yeah,
terms that are,
strategic. Like you kind of
yeah.
have to kind of look at it. A legal advisor can tell you like maybe what areas would be good to push on and what the
Mhm.
risk is if you agree to, so you can make an informed decision versus signing something in a vacuum, right? And not really understanding what you're getting into.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, as particularly the tech enabled folks that you talk with and software, how can these kind of tech forward founders, they're trying to move forward, but what can they do to balance kind of their innovation with compliance? And I mean, what are the things they should be looking at, maybe auditing their existing agreements or terms? What's some of the smart legal planning that they can do?
Yeah, I think, well, it's good to get legal involved as early
Hmm.
as possible. And
Hmm.
I'll use an example. There was a business I had talked to, and they'd come to me about a year and a half after they'd been working out on building out a hardware prototype with software built in. They had paid consultants. They'd spent time and money to grow this thing. And then they came to me, analyzed their business model, and it was illegal. So now they were faced with changing their whole business model, and that didn't even get rid of the criminal liability potentially on issue, right? And so they decided to
Hmm.
actually shut down their business. But that could have been avoided if they'd come to me on day one and I told them, hey, this is a problem. Don't go down this route. Maybe consider another route. So I think
Hmm.
if you're early stage business, at least having an attorney that you can have periodic strategic discussions with to help guide
Yeah.
you towards what direction you should be going in, or even particular deals. Like if you don't have the budget to get the attorney involved with drafting it, you can at least get them involved to help you think about what are the important issues and what really needs to be in there, so that there
Mhm.
is at least some guidance that you're going in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you're saying that too, depending, I've heard people, start with one way, they're trying to get funding, and do they set up, how they set up, like you said, the business, or is it a joint venture? Is this a partnership? What are we putting in here? And then, like, you advising them more read as to like what, there's pluses and minuses. What are the things they need to consider as the business evolves, right?
Yes, yes, very much so. And yeah, I've even had clients who've been sole founders who've messed up the corporate structure and paperwork, and then they've had to spend a lot of time and money to clean it up later when they're going to look for investments. So it's a lot more cost effective and less stressful to get counsel early on.
Mhm. And like you mentioned this earlier too about, if you get this set up correctly, how this can help you as you get maybe acquired or merged, right? You know?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Because anytime you're looking at investment or an acquisition or merger, due diligence is going to happen. So they're going to want to see not only all the corporate paperwork is in order, but they're going to want all your customer agreements, your vendor agreements, partner agreements. All of that has to look good. Your intellectual property has to look good.
Mhm.
Financials have to look good. Like all of that's going to come out.
Yeah. I mean, there's different elements, and depending on the business model and what's set up, and like I said, you've had a lot of experience in SaaS, software as a service, and others. But depending on the business model, what kind of agreements or licensing that you have to have in place, that, getting something like you in Marvy to look at all that stuff, right? Have they, like you said, do they have those policies and terms and conditions and all of those things?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Any business, it's going to be, for example, the customer agreements. So that may
Mhm.
take different forms depending on what kind of business they are. So if they're like a service business, that might be an MSA and SOWs. If they're a SaaS company, that'll be software agreements, SaaS agreements. And then of course it's going to be the vendor agreements, which will be a whole various forms of agreements based on what the vendor is doing for them, right? Whether it's a consultant, to whether they're having, they have SaaS companies that they're hiring, right, to do
Yes.
like hosting or software for them. And
Mhm.
then there's the different partnerships that some businesses explore as ways to generate more revenue, and those can take various forms, from reseller agreements to strategic alliances. So it's really, those can get to API licensing. It could be all sorts of different forms depending on what the business is exploring as ways to generate revenue.
Yeah. And so, as we're getting close to the end of the episode here, because you're gonna have to come back. We're gonna have to have another legal roundtable, I think, because there's so many different things here to cover. But let's just, if they're, like you said, if they started up, or you're along your journey, maybe you haven't, you've got going, but what would you say, kind of as a wrapping up, like what's a legal step that maybe they should be looking at taking this quarter, like sooner than later, if they haven't done anything, or if they don't have somebody regularly that they can rely on as a legal counsel? What would you say? Hey, let's start here. Let's get going and cleaning up some things, or help getting your house in order.
Yeah, so I always think one of the biggest priorities for any business is the customer agreement, because that's how the company is generating revenue, and it's also how the liabilities exposure of the company is set. So that agreement, getting that a well-drafted customer agreement, is very important. So that can take, again, different forms depending on what your business is and whether it's B2B or B2C. But I think that is a very good investment, because it's a document that once you have the proper framework set up, you're basically using over and over with your different customers.
That's great, because find the things that you're going to be using repeatedly. Maybe I work with environmental or consulting firms, for example. They have a master services agreement or an SOW. Like, can you get that dialed in? Do you say that's a good use too, to focus on something like that?
That's exact example. MSA SOW for service companies. That's an important to clean up.
Yeah. And, I think AI is great. I think it's wonderful. It's a great tool out there, but, it doesn't replace somebody like you, Morvareed, that can actually go back and really look at this and know what it should look like. I mean, I could go put something in technology, but I don't know ultimately what it should look like. I have an idea, but having somebody like yourself that can say, hey, bring this to me and then let me help you.
Yeah, and I will say any of these agreements are really specific to the business. And I think that's where it makes the difference of having something custom drafted by an attorney versus, cut and paste from somewhere.
Yeah. Well, Morvareed, we're so grateful to have you here on the podcast. This is a fantastic discussion. I'm sure we'll have you back. For those of you that want to connect with her, please, look up Morvareed Salehpour on the LinkedIn. We're connected there. We're going to provide her link to her website, Salehpour Legal. Thank you so much for being here, Morvareed. It was wonderful having you.
Thank you for having me, David. I was glad to join you all.
Thanks, everybody. Please like, subscribe, leave your comments. We'll be sure to reply, share them with Morvareed. And again, thanks everybody for joining us on the Business Roundtable Podcast. Take care, everybody. Bye.